Before this video is over, I'm going to convince you that 47 million is a bigger number than 825 million. Kinda, sorta. In a manner of speaking, you'll get it when we get there. Superman is breaking box office records, yet some people online have been calling it a box office disappointment. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of people compare the worldwide figures and the worldwide gross of the film to other DC films, such as Man of Steel, The Dark Knight, or even the original Superman films' box office gross, when adjusted for inflation. Some have also compared it to Black Adam, but that's a more favorable comparison for Superman. As of this writing, 2025 Superman is set to break 400 million worldwide after its second weekend out, with some significant retention of its audience from week to week. And in fact, as of recording of this message, it's gone a little further past 400 million. It ranks among the top 10 releases of the year so far. It's demonstrated substantial retention of its audience from week to week. Domestic numbers are up, while international numbers are a little sluggish, in particular the Asian markets, specifically China and South Korea. Now, while some analysts see this as a huge success for DC's revamped brand, others, especially amateur film critics and analysts, see it as a sign of doom for the fledgling DC universe as well as the superhero genre as a whole. After all, Avengers Endgame grossed just short of 2.8 billion worldwide in 2019. In its opening weekend, Avengers Endgame grossed more than Superman's entire first week. So yeah, that's a staggering difference on paper. It's easy to compare one of the biggest successes of all time to a new beginning, especially when it's all the heroes of Marvel versus just Superman. But looking at raw numbers without context can often result in you missing out a few key details. Endgame had a decade of build-up to it, while Superman is coming off a decade of DC's inconsistent films, is one way of putting it.
Why did you say that name?
The most important thing that Superman had to do was regain audience goodwill. Something similar happened with Batman Begins back in the day. The film grossed a worldwide total of 375 million against a budget of 150 million. It basically just broke even. I'll explain the formula later. However, it instilled such goodwill in audiences that they were more than eager to watch The Dark Knight when it dropped in theaters, which made it a small number of films at that time to break $1 billion at the box office. How quaint, 2008 when breaking $1 billion was a rarity. Because $1 billion at the box office for a while became the standard target box office gross to merit success, at least in the eyes of the public. See, film budgets had ballooned so much that films needed an absurd amount of money at the box office to turn a profit for the studio. So recently, film fans have been looking at movies that are fairly successful and disregarding them as flops, because they didn't cross the standard that had previously been used to dictate was a film a hit or not. But as we can see, as film audiences change their film viewing habits, opting to watch films either on VOD or on streaming services, box office numbers have shrank substantially. Take a look at the last several years of box office totals, the top 10 of every year. There are fewer and fewer films each year to break $1 billion, if any break $1 billion. I guess this video is more just a loose assembly of thoughts about box office, how it dictates everything that comes out on film, and why we as film fans are naturally obsessed with numbers that tick up over time following a film's release, and how this can drastically change the conversations around a film away from the artistic merits and the quality of the film, and more about big number bigger than last year's big number big, big number small, what big number mean? Because sometimes a lower box office haul can actually mean more success for a studio. Now, I want to say before digging into this one of the bigger sources for this video, as well as a place I am very critical of, as will be clear as I go on with this video, the subreddit BoxOffice. r/BoxOffice is a subreddit devoted to tracking box office numbers. It catalogs trends and creates formulas to accurately predict how much every film will earn across its theatrical run. It's a subreddit run by fairly intelligent people who try to bring a degree of predictability to the unpredictable box office. Now, this is based on online chatter, pre-sale trends, international numbers, right down to a general time of film debuts and the typical trends how films are in that time period. It's very complex, and they cite their sources pretty thoroughly. Obviously, the subreddit is not clairvoyant or can predict the future at all. When predicting the estimates for the opening weekend for Superman, for example, they guessed anywhere from 70 million to 175 million. It landed somewhere in between, but they can sometimes guess way off the mark. And they were changing their estimates day by day by day leading up to the film's release. Now, I won't pretend to understand all the math, though. I'm not a mathematician, after all. I was always more into the art of storytelling than the mathematics of business success. But I want to say right now that I respect box office analysts and the work they do. It's not without merit, and it is very important. Film studios use box office metrics in order to determine what films they do or do not want to greenlight. Entire franchises have been destroyed before they can begin due to low box office totals, such as Dragon Ball Evolution. Okay, maybe the box office analysts were onto something when sometimes low numbers are good. The era of the box office can be pinpointed to the mid-70s, when two films, Steven Spielberg's Jaws and George Lucas's Star Wars, debuted. And by Star Wars I mean A New Hope. It was just called Star Wars when it came out. That's not to say they weren't massively successful films prior to those two. Obviously, the decades before had the massive historical epics like The Ten Commandments, Lawrence of Arabia, etc., and Broadway musicals. But that whole industry had imploded upon itself. The golden age of Hollywood was over by the 70s. This was due to rising budgets and diminishing audience interest in the massive musicals. That led to a decline, alongside the declines of the epic and the western. Flops like Cleopatra and Dr. Dolittle kind of put an end to that era of filmmaking. When New Hollywood hit and new directors produced films like The Godfather, Taxi Driver, The Exorcist, Rocky, that helped herald a new era of more grounded, darker storytelling. That ended with the flop known as Heaven's Gate. Jaws and Star Wars happened to come out right before Heaven's Gate and ushered in a new era of bombast and size and scale. For a while, film fans used box office as a general tracker of the industry's health and popularity of certain kinds of movies. After all, the popular narrative was that westerns all but disappeared after a series of high-profile flops, so many people came to believe that superhero movies would experience a similar drop-off. Overexposure would eventually lead to audiences losing interest. Now, this narrative is an oversimplification by general audiences, because of course it is. The Western never truly disappeared, but more dropped off in terms of quality, re-emerging every few years to garner critical or societal praise before falling backwards into relevancy, or irrelevancy of course. Keep in mind, one of the most popular shows of the 2020s was Yellowstone, which is itself a massive Western. Westerns never went away, they just became less relevant, and often Westerns just weren't successful at the box office. I guess some people would point to The Lone Ranger as being a case that Westerns are box office poison, but there's more to it than that. Lone Ranger failed because it just wasn't a very good movie. But I'd say a movie like No Country for Old Men, that's a Western, essentially. Kind of. Indeed, whenever a new franchise was about to start, you needed to gauge audience interest via box office success. Famously, Dredd, the adaptation of the Judge Dredd comics, the second, as a matter of fact, ended up leading nowhere when its debut film underperformed at the box office, among other factors. This is despite good word of mouth and despite video sales and streaming numbers proving the film had found its audience after its initial release. Of course, it could be because the film wasn't popular with general audiences based on an unknown IP prior, or because the marketing budget didn't really sell audiences on what the film actually was. Once it was on streaming or on DVD shelves, it became easier for an audience to justify paying to see it, as opposed to watching a random movie at the movie theaters. Tickets are pricey. It's a gamble whenever you go to an unknown film, not knowing what to expect. Box office analysts were able to tell when the age of the movie star was fading as well, when movies led by big stars stopped being guaranteed box office hits. Before in the 80s, people would go see the new Stallone movie, the new Schwarzenegger movie. In the 2010s and even 2000s, they'd see the new Spider-Man movie. Who was playing Spider-Man? Not as important. It's Spider-Man. The recognizable IP was important. Audiences recognize patterns and respond to certain patterns. Those patterns are reflected in box office numbers, which is why industry experts saw them as valuable. The future of film was determined by what films made money, and film enthusiasts, casual fans, became more and more plugged in to the pattern of film success. But of course, like everything, they didn't quite... It was too simple. They oversimplified it. Big number, good. That's easy to understand. Low number, bad. Right? Well, there are more factors at play here. The math isn't always as straightforward as it might initially appear. A great example of a film that completely broke patterns this very year was Ryan Coogler's Sinners. Yes, horror has always been profitable, but Sinners was an original IP based on nothing previously that managed to rise quickly into domestic box office results. And a lot of journalists and a lot of film publications struggled to understand its success. Despite it being an original IP in an era dominated by adaptations, a lot of box office analysts were very skeptical that it could recoup its $90 million budget. It then did that, and then some. And then articles came out saying that it wasn't a short sign that horror was a guaranteed success because of other different horror failures, which is troubling. Several online commentators, such as The Critical Drinker, just outright refused to even acknowledge Sinners' existence on their main channels, relegating reviews for Sinners after several weeks of the film grossing and raking in profits to side channels, less obvious ones, as though it was a secondary concern for them. Increasingly, it appears that the box office is being treated like this fetishistic metric of quality. Casual audiences regarded the film Snow White as a failure, not because the film is bad, it was also not very good, but rather because it had a low box office score. Critical reception, who cares about that? Box office numbers, you can't fight that. You can't argue hard math. 2025 Snow White grossed a little over 87 million domestically and over 118 million internationally. By comparison, the top grossing live-action Disney film, The Lion King, grossed 543 million domestically and 1.1 billion internationally. The Lion King's opening weekend dwarfed the entire collective gross of Snow White. For that matter, so did the opening for 2025 Superman movie. So that means that Disney is losing it, right? By the metrics we discussed earlier, with comparing it to the Western and its fall off, comparing it to the age of the Blockbuster star and its fall off, this meant that Disney's live-action era was over. The box office numbers proved it. This meant the end of the long trend of Disney adapting its classic animated movies into live-action films. But they were a little premature to declare the age of the live-action Disney adaptation over. Because it wasn't Disney fatigue, audiences just didn't want to see this version of Snow White. And we know that because then Lilo and Stitch came out and was the first American film of 2025 to gross over $1 billion. I say American, we'll get to that later. I feel like a lot of box office analysts didn't pick up on the fact that Snow White failed, not because the Disney trend was going away, but because audiences just didn't want to see Snow White. That's the issue. Or rather, didn't want to pay money to see Snow White. What are families going to spend their money on? A film that looks mediocre, or a film that looks like it appeals to their sensibilities? Over the last 15 years or so, there's been an increased obsession with box office as a metric outside of Hollywood, with film fans predicting trends based purely on a couple isolated stories, rather than looking holistically at the full picture. Oftentimes, amateur box office analysts can look at the grossing patterns of films in a series and determine diminishing interest when it's just following an established pattern. Case in point, Disney's Star Wars trilogy. The sequels followed a certain pattern, where The Force Awakens grossed a massive amount of money, and the following two films grossed less. This was holding the same pattern established throughout the Star Wars trilogies, where the first entry in each trilogy garnered the biggest attention from audiences, before slowly cooling off. However, amateurs who were not familiar with the greater trends in box office history looked at the sequels in isolation and thought, wow, that's a strange trend, not noticing that it is, of course, typical of what happened with Star Wars trilogies previously. This is an example of people looking at numbers without fully grasping the patterns established by previous numbers. Trends in Hollywood shift, yet people still act as though we're living through the multi-billion-dollar-a-year films of the 2010s, a heyday of cinematic profit, or rather, massive budgets and massive returns. However, things are a little different now, and a studio's poor planning in terms of budgeting their films can result in a film failing to capitalize on a growing, loyal audience and good, strong word of mouth. The very same thing that helped franchises throughout the 80s and 90s prior to the release of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, another chapter in the Blockbuster saga. As a result, they might overspend prematurely, or spend too much where it may not be necessary, and turn what would otherwise be a hit into a flop. Let's start with Raimi's Spider-Man though, because Raimi's Spider-Man and Bryan Singer's X-Men were both fairly successful at the box office. X-Men grossed $296 worldwide on a budget of $75 million, and Spider-Man grossed $825 million worldwide on a budget of $139 million. Now, those numbers might seem small by comparison to Black Panther's over $1 billion, but you gotta remember the formula. The formula to determine if a film is successful or not is this. Take the film's production budget and multiply it by 2.5. This formula accounts for marketing budget, the cut of the gross absorbed by theaters, as well as overseas, the cut of the gross absorbed by each country that shows and screens that film. Once X-Men crossed $187.5 or Spider-Man crossed $347.5 million, everything beyond that was profit for the studio. That was the break-even point based on the formula. And it's based on a lot of different studies. It's not a perfect formula, but it's a general idea that most analysts use as a point of reference. And from there, the budgets grew, as did the profits. Spend more money on sequels, get more money when the film is bigger than what came before. Right? That's how it works. Right? Because no X-Men film after the first one was as cheap as the first X-Men film. They got bigger and bigger, same with Spider-Man. But here's the thing. Years prior, a lot of franchises didn't gross a ton of money per release. But because it cost substantially less to make the movies, they turn a healthy, consistent profit. And I'm going to use an example right now from one of the most financially independent films of all time. One that sparked a franchise that is still going to this day, despite ending multiple times. John Carpenter's Halloween. Halloween is to date one of the most successful film franchises to ever exist, lasting nearly 50 years with multiple reboots and timeline adjustments to reinvent Michael Myers for every generation. However, we're looking at box office, right? Not film quality or what have you. On paper, the original Halloween's grossing, which is primarily domestic, it didn't really go much overseas, it looks pathetic. It grossed only $47 million, with a relatively small international run, where it got $11.7 thousand internationally. That sounds like nothing. We're talking about hundreds of millions, and Halloween's the most successful one? But there's more than meets the eye here. See, you gotta consider a couple things. First off, ticket price and inflation. Tickets today are worth far, far more than in 1978. This chart from BoxOffice, the subreddit, it kind of sorts some data from the National Association of Theater Owners, which is, I found out the abbreviation for that is NATO. Odd choice there. They also adjusted the ticket prices on average with inflation, and in 2025 the average ticket price is approximately $13 to $15, accounting for special screenings as well as discount screenings, etc. But in 1978, those same tickets would have cost you around $2.5, and even accounting for inflation, that's still substantially less than a ticket would cost today. You were spending maybe half the amount on a ticket. This meant more people were willing to take a risk on a film like John Carpenter's Halloween. As time went on, good word of mouth was built around the fan base. People started talking about it. It was becoming a bigger thing. And of course, back then, movies weren't released nationally like they are now. They were released section by section across the country. And when it came time for sequels, everyone had already seen Halloween. It was on TV. They borrowed the video cassette. They'd watched it in screenings, etc. So by the time Halloween 2 came out, more people went to see it. Halloween 3, 4, 5, 6, however many, they went to see it based purely on word of mouth and expectations of the IP. 2018's Halloween grossed $259.9 million against a budget of $10 million. Which brings me to the second thing. Halloween, the original film's budget, was $325,000. That's right, a tiny sub-$1 million budget. Even adjusted for inflation, that would make it $1.5 million in today's money. This film had a tiny budget. When looking at Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, its film grossed a little less than 6 times its production budget. X-Men grossed just short of 4 times its budget. Halloween 2018, well, that grossed 26 times its own budget. But the original Halloween, John Carpenter's $47 million box office turn, equals 144.6 times the film's production budget. Let me give you some perspective here. Let's say you're an investor for all these films, right? Accounting for the 2.5 formula, for every dollar you put into X-Men, after you got your money back from the returns and all that, you got an extra $1.50. So you walked away with $2.5 for every dollar you put in. Now, for Spider-Man, you walked away with an extra $4.50. Not bad, right? Now, every dollar put into John Carpenter's Halloween, you got over $142 back, roughly. So, what's the more profitable endeavor? There are many film studios that use the Halloween structure, low budgets, high return, for profit. Jason Blum, Blumhouse, he makes a dozen films a year, and they all cost next to nothing. 5 million, 10 million, 20 million maybe at most. And if 5 of them fail, who cares? Because the successes are so profitable that it eclipses all the other costs possible. Even if they get one hit a year, that hit's enough to pay for their entire years of production. And they all can then sell those films to streaming services and make more profit from that. Then there's Roger Corman, the famous film producer. He made hundreds of films and he claimed to have only lost money on one over the course of hundreds. And he made them by being as cheap as possible. He would take McDonald's containers, the old styrofoam ones he used to have, paint them with spray paint and say, oh, here's a metal wall. Let's plaster it on the wall. There's your metal hall. Let's fill a whole hallway with them. There's your sci-fi space room. You can never tell that he made them out of styrofoam and cheapness. They look like, in the camera, they look like metal. They're lit to look about right. Any seams in production hidden behind dark lighting. It's funny, James Cameron, who became James Cameron, used to work for Corman. And he took the skills he learned from Corman and applied it to Terminator and Aliens, and then later on Titanic and Avatar. Jaws itself, the film that kickstarted this trend, was in effect a horror film, with effects that didn't work because of the cheapness of it all. For Jaws, one of the big films of the 70s that was a massive hit was another horror film, The Exorcist. Against its $11 million budget, it grossed $430 million worldwide. When adjusted for inflation, The Exorcist is one of the highest grossing R-rated films of all time, and thus one of the most profitable films of all time. Let's take this lesson and apply it to our modern filmmaking landscape. The last several MCU and DC films have grossed inconsistently, with the meme being with every release, Marvel Studios has either fallen off or it's back in business, baby. In the post-COVID landscape, these films have either been the biggest hits of their years or the biggest flops of their years. Some films like Spider-Man No Way Home, Black Panther Wakanda Forever, Guardians of the Galaxy 3, Deadpool and Wolverine, Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness did extremely well at the box office, while others didn't, like the Marvels. But a lot of audiences will point to the disappointing week-to-week gross of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania as the point where the MCU really fell off, using box office metrics to demonstrate in real time the lack of enthusiasm people had for this film.
Like fire!
It was bad word of mouth, people just generally didn't like it, and a lot of people point to that as the turning point of the 2020s. I, however, instead point to streaming. With more options for audiences to experience films, audiences will opt to watch big budget movies in more affordable ways. Ticket prices are pricier than ever, and superhero films that underperformed at the box office tend to shoot to the top of streaming charts once they're made available on services that people already are subscribed to. Take Captain America: Brave New World. The film grossed a mere $415 million worldwide. Now, by comparison, the first Captain America film, all the way back in 2011, that brought in $370.5 million. The second, $714 million, and the third, Civil War, a staggering $1.1 billion. However, When Brave New World was released on Disney Plus, it shot to the top of views on the service. A lot of people were just waiting to see it for cheap. According to Nielsen's tracking data, Brave New World was streamed for 750 million minutes in its first week on Disney Plus, making it one of the most watched films of 2025 on Disney Plus. Audiences did not want to leave their homes to watch Brave New World, but they did have an interest in watching it at some point. Audiences wanted to see it, but they did not want to pay money to see it in the theater. And there is the big issue. If we looked purely at box office numbers, we'd completely misjudge viewer interest in this franchise, and therefore, from a business perspective, profitable potential from this franchise. But I want to draw attention to one important thing: the budget. Brave New World had a budget of $180 million. This is a significant factor, because this makes it the first of a number of MCU films to have dramatically lowered their budgets. To give you an idea, The Marvels, which lost Disney a ton of money, it grossed $206 million worldwide against a budget of $374 million. Though in fairness, thanks to tax breaks, Disney saved a little bit of money. They only end up spending a net budget of $307.3 million. But even then, this makes it one of the biggest losses of Disney's history, even compared to The Lone Ranger and John Carter, which were two of the biggest flops historically previously. The big lesson here, though: budgets, get them lower. Learn from John Carpenter in the 70s. Less money spent in these films, higher profit potential. And that way, when you don't score $1 billion at the box office, it's not a disaster, is it? But wait, we're not done yet, because a similar fate befell DC's The Flash, a film that had a massive budget and minimal box office success. However, unlike The Marvels or Captain America Brave New World, when it came to streaming, people did also see The Flash and downright hated it. You see, the thing with The Marvels is a lot of people online, when they saw it, were like, oh, this film's not so bad. I kind of enjoy it, actually. Sure, some people hated it, but it was more mixed when it came out on streaming because people actually watched it. Same with Brave New World. With The Flash, The Flash is universally hated by almost everyone who's seen it. It's a catastrophic failure. And yeah, the effects in all these films isn't great, but The Flash's effects are downright terrible. Like, Jesus. So we should just stop using CGI to make babies. Like, these babies are terrifying. And the whole Christopher Reeve, George Reeves scene where they make CGI models of their face with Nicolas Cage and all that, with Adam West, it's just bizarre choices made. A lot of expensive choices that ultimately turned audiences off of the film rather than turned them onto it. Except I kind of just lied to you right now. Completely, right to your face. Because in actuality, The Flash, despite being one of the most widely criticized superhero films among comic book fans, actually has almost the same IMDb, Letterboxd, and Rotten Tomato audience score as the other films I already mentioned. In fact, even Madam Web, which is widely regarded as one of the worst superhero films of the last 5 years, got a massive reception on Netflix when it debuted on the platform, which means even the films that we commonly criticize as being among the worst still find an audience that watches it. They just aren't vocal online typically. Both The Marvels and The Flash failed, but neither marked the end of Marvel or DC as a whole series, a franchise, but rather it marked a transition era, something we saw that was similar to when the first Iron Man came out. It was not the end of the Western, but the end of an era. And that's important to distinct. See, what people don't remember that is that prior to the first Avengers film, superhero films were in a similar state as they are now. There were several high-profile films that were successful, that were good, that are iconic with iconic characters, but most didn't do too well. The Dark Knight and Iron Man were both major hits, but as we said before, Batman Begins wasn't. And that's not even getting to films like Jonah Hex, The Green Lantern, The Rise of the Silver Surfer, Elektra. Yeah, less about those the better, probably. They weren't the big hits that we're seeing today. 2011's Thor had a budget of $150 million and grossed $448 million. It's a modest success, but not a runaway hit. No Thor film has ever grossed $1 billion, but over time, the character built popularity with audiences. When Thor Love and Thunder disappointed general audiences, it still turned a substantial profit because of faith from the audience, but it also damaged that word of mouth moving forward for the MCU due to the film's lower quality. Low box office can sometimes be healthy for a franchise if it helps restore faith in what is to come, but a successful film, like Thor Love and Thunder, can hurt a franchise if it leaves a lot of people going out to see it with less faith in projects moving forward. To specifically look only at numbers is to miss a lot of the big picture. A lot of the box office subreddit people look, for example, for cinema scores, seeing how people feel when leaving the theater. A low score usually indicates that audiences are not going to recommend this film to their friends or want to see more of this IP moving forward. It takes years to build faith in an audience, which is why the Fantastic Four and Superman, I feel, are new films to help establish a more stable trajectory to come. I think the Thunderbolts, though a box office disappointment, did a lot to build better word of mouth moving forward. Without the Thunderbolts, audiences might still be very cynical following the others' failures, and may not have been as receptive to these films. If you look at the films that have succeeded in the last 5 years, all of them are IP driven, but often they're the first entries of a new IP. Barbie, Minecraft, Super Mario Bros. Movie. They're new enough that audiences haven't seen them time and time again recently, and are thus more willing to spend money on something they perceive to be different. They are a risk for studios, but they're a calculated risk. But what happens if you put a lot of money into a film series that exists, that's an IP, but the money you put in is way too much for the project it's going to be? It's illogical, because you know you're not going to make your money back. June 11, 1982, 3 sci-fi films come out. E.T., Blade Runner, and The Thing. Now, all are classics, but only one, E.T., was a financial hit, one of the most successful films of all time. But Blade Runner and The Thing underperformed dramatically. The Thing grossed $20.8 million against a budget of $15 million, while Blade Runner, on a budget of $30 million, grossed $41.7 million. By the metrics we included, the 2.5 multiplier, both flopped at the box office, but have since been regarded as some of the greatest sci-fi films of the decade. They have a massive audience thanks entirely to the video market, and both received follow-ups that cost more money, and both didn't do so great. I feel the 2011 Thing prequel had a far more manageable budget. It pulled in $31.5 million against a budget of $38 million. It was a flop, but not a catastrophic one. That movie had some financial problems, due in part to them covering up all their incredible practical effects with CGI garbage, all in the vain hope that CGI would appeal more to a modern audience. Ironically, what they actually did was alienate the original fans by hiding incredible practical effects, and they all looked fake and it was artificial, and bad word of mouth killed this prequel before it had a chance. Blade Runner 2049 is regarded as one of the better sci-fi films of the 2010s, thanks in no small part to its director, Denis Villeneuve. The film cost $150 million and only took in a worldwide gross of $277.9 million. Again, by our metric, it needed closer to $350 to profit. It was a flop. But it's also a great film, one that helped Denis get bigger and bigger work later on, including Dune. Now, film studios assumed that because Blade Runner and The Thing had a built-in audience, that they could afford to put money into what followed them up. But in both cases, they found that audiences were much smaller than anticipated. Yet despite the flop of Blade Runner 2049, a follow-up is being made right now. Blade Runner 2099. And it's being made for streaming. Amazon Prime, specifically. I bet you didn't know it was being made. I'm not surprised. No one's really talking about it. But the case is, 2 flops means we get another film. And by the way, this is ignoring the anime spin-offs and the video game spin-offs and all that. Despite none of these films making their studios a dime, we keep getting more of them. And granted, Blade Runner is amazing. We get more good Blade Runner, I'm happy about that. But its continued existence breaks the logic that we as film fans understand. If a film franchise doesn't make money, it dies. So why is this not making money and continuing to thrive? Well, simply put, success can sometimes take multiple forms. If it draws you into a streaming service and you pay a subscription to that service to keep watching something new, that profits someone. A lot of movies that were flops at the box office would later become hits on video. And granted, the physical media market has kind of dried up, but streamers still want content to draw people in, to keep you subscribed. Does it always work? No. Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power was one of the most expensive TV shows ever made, and season to season, there's been a drop-off in attention. The initial novelty could not hold casual audiences' attention, especially given the fact that the show itself was of questionable, inconsistent quality. I don't think it's as terrible as people say it is, but I think that first season is rough, and while it does find its footing more in season 2, finding its footing is not the same thing as it being good. There's a lot of competition right now for film, with streaming, with small media like TikTok. Hell, YouTube is competing with TikTok. My video right now is competing with short-form content, and nowhere is the competition between long-form content and short-form content more clear than in China. You see, for a while in the 2010s, China was a growing market, a vital place to market films in order to take advantage of their massive population. Disney especially invested heavily in the Chinese market, creating multiple theme parks to help market their brand to the Chinese. However, nowadays, films that get sent to China, if any do, don't perform as well as they used to. Superman, for example, is flopping hard in China. So a lot of people have concluded that the Chinese market just wants Chinese films. If you look at box office charts, the highest grossing film this year is not Lilo and Stitch. It's Ne Zha 2, a Chinese animated film which managed to gross almost $2 billion this year, and the year is only halfway through. However, when you look at the Chinese market for 2025, Ne Zha 2 is, which I'm not pronouncing by the way, Chinese audiences bully me for how badly I pronounce that. Its situation is unique. Arguably, the second most popular film in the Chinese market for 2025 was the last Mission Impossible film. And there's a huge margin between the Chinese hit and Mission Impossible. 2024, the box office for China fell 23% year over year, which itself was down 14.5% from pre-pandemic numbers. And some have theorized that Chinese audiences are hesitant to go to the theater after the pandemic. Others think it's national pride, rejecting the American cinema in favor of Chinese cinema, but that doesn't account for how low the box office is generally. A lot of Chinese films come out year to year. But I think what's more likely, and a lot of people agree with me, Chinese audiences prefer short-form content over long-form content. This is nowhere more obvious than with a ton of short-form content made in China. Tons of films made for vertical screens and all that, broken up into chapters that you can watch on your phone. Chinese box office is no longer an indication of health for cinema, because they're not looking at the movie theaters anymore. They're on their phones. Why go pay money for a ticket when your phone has 1,500 films you can watch in short chunks? Add to that the idea of the event film, something that is so unique and special you have to see it in theaters. That doesn't always translate overseas, but it does translate in America. And a great example of that is the Barbenheimer trend. Two films that are drastically different, released on the same day. It's the kind of thing that can only happen on social media. Two drastically different films organically being first pitted together before being aligned together, creating a fascinating double feature of two vastly different films. And its success is the kind of oddity that can only happen by accident, because studios have been trying to recreate it and nothing fans out. They can't recapture lightning in a bottle with this strange double feature. Although I would say Superman and Fantastic Four, two fairly similar films, have been having a kind of conjoined cross-promotion of sorts. It's noteworthy that Thunderbolts and Thor have both roughly the same domestic box office, but international box office for Thunderbolts lags behind Thor. I'm talking 2011 Thor specifically. Each film industry is facing its own hurdles, and that's resulting in a generally lower box office across the board. So, what's the point with all this? Box office numbers are down. Overall, across the entire world. It could be a pretty important metric, but audiences have to remember it's never the full picture of why some films do or don't succeed. Streaming, physical media, merchandise, there are other factors at play here. that we need to consider before determining if a film is profitable. It's important to never let discussions of these numbers eclipse what matters: the art. People get so caught up in statistics and thinking how they know everything. Remember I mentioned The Flash and the Marvels? While The Flash became a discussion surrounding the film's negative quality, the Marvels discussion was about the money it did or didn't make. Very few people actually talked about the quality of the film. They only talked about how it was a bomb, and they used it as a punching bag for this greater culture war against Disney. Very few people actually could discuss the film in detail, why it didn't appeal to audiences. But there's a lesson to be learned that studios were listening to. Why didn't it succeed? Why did people not want to see this? It could also have to do with the fact that the actors' strike was going on. The actors couldn't promote the film, but I digress. That's nonsense. What are you talking about? Promoting a film affecting budget or profitability? That's nonsense. Recently, Variety sat down with Kevin Feige, the main producer at Marvel Studios, to ask him where the direction of films were going in. And one thing he pointed to was lowering the budget of each film. The brands still have attention, but they need to reformulate how they do things. But also, film studios should listen to what fans want. What are we responding to? They want to see more films for kids, for example, as Lilo and Stitch indicated. They want to see more adventurous films that take a stance with new IP, like Mario or Minecraft. Yes, they are based on IP, but they never been adapted before. Something new, something distinct. And there's nothing bad for film audiences if established IP have to reinvent themselves to keep people interested. Unfortunately, that also leaves a small wiggle room for a totally original IP, which is why I want to highlight something right now. There are a lot of films made that do succeed based on good word of mouth, and a great example of that is John Wick. The first John Wick had a very low budget, yet garnered a huge success thanks to positive word of mouth, and that merited enough faith in the franchise to make a sequel, then another, then another. A franchise organically built up through positive word of mouth. It seems uncanny nowadays, but it can happen. Start with a realistic budget, so that there's a minimal loss potentially, and build from there. And then listen to what fans were receptive to build from there to keep an audience engaged. Not to be slavishly devoted to what fans say, because again, that can happen. I mean, everyone wanted to see cameos in all these superhero films, and then we got The Flash, which had cameos galore, and everyone hated it. So you can't be too slavish, but you have to acknowledge what general audiences want to see. And not just fans, but general audiences, because it's not just the hardcore fans who showed up. If hardcore fans were enough to make a film successful, then we'd be getting 15 Dredd movies by now, because every one of them would have been a hit. But there are a lot of original movies that are very successful. They're not multi-$100 million films, but they make their budget back and then some. And one example I want to highlight are the films of Roger Eggers. Eggers has made some of the best films, I think, of the 2010s, starting with The Witch, a fantastic historical horror film that cost a very little money to make and made a moderate-sized box office return, but due to the low investment, was a hit. It inspired him to make bigger films, and good word of mouth allowed his name to become a bigger deal. The Lighthouse, The Northman, both fantastic films made with a little bit more money than previously. This culminated in him being able to direct Nosferatu, a film that was a success, that was a hit, that got Oscar nominations, that got horror fans excited. Giving a director like this a chance with a small project that builds. We need to have lower risk films to allow newer film creators and auteurs a chance to come into the industry and prove themselves, providing a new fresh voice that can regain audience interests. We can't get the same thing over and over again, but we can tell a similar story differently. One of the reasons I think Superman's such a hit is because it's so different from Man of Steel. It's a new voice to a familiar character. We need to reinvent our icons every few years to keep them from being stale, to keep them from being familiar, to keep them from being something you can wait to see when it comes on streaming. You gotta be able to reinvent the wheel every so often, just as we're getting comfortable with it. Audiences should not be comfortable. We should be engaged. And through engagement, we can have true success. And so the box office is not an indicator of what is and isn't working, what should be and should not be canceled, but rather a barometer as to what we're familiar with versus what excites us.
You look lonely.
I can fix that.